And some of these checks are going to be automatic, looking for errors in the model. There are also visual checks that you're going to want to perform to make sure that no details were left out or that something didn't get lost when it was translated. As we had mentioned before, there are cases where it may skip a piece of the beam if the nodes were moved, so that when it goes to well, only if you're using the mesh normals to compute the direction of the beam. If you've moved the mesh nodes and they no longer match up with the beam nodes, then when it goes to find the normal of the associated mesh, if they don't share nodes, then it can't find the associated mesh, and it'll fail to write out that beam segment. And you would see a gap in the beam. And that's also actually mentioned in that video that I had referenced that's on the Maestro Marine website that talks about running the export beam script. There's an example in there, I think, that shows when those beam segments can get missed. But just a visual inspection on here, we can see that there are a couple of beam segments up forward that are missing. You know, a couple of these shell stringers didn't quite make it all the way to the bow. So we'll just fill those in a little later, but a visual inspection is something that you probably always want to do. And we can see here, there's a frame right on the bulkhead. That one is going to be found automatically. We'll find that probably with the overlapped elements check. So that's what we'll run first. Is I tend to run these in the order of the element connectivity, and that one usually passes. And then the next one I do is the overlapped elements. And actually, it wasn't mentioned in the help file, but there are some additional ones that have been added, which are the frame stiffener depth ratio and the girder frame depth ratio. So you can make certain that if there's a requirement that your beams can't be too dissimilar in size, switching from a frame to a stiffener or a girder to a frame, you can run this check and set what the ratio is. So if you don't want your frames to be any less than half the height of the girder, or rather you don't want your girder to be more than double the height of your frame, this is a quick way of checking it. Now we can't actually run that check yet because we haven't assigned properties to any of the beams. So we don't know what's a frame, what's a girder, and what's a stiffener yet. So those checks aren't useful to us yet. The other checks are mainly straight geometry checks, and those we can run. So when we run the overlapped elements check, it'll scan through the entire model. It tells us there are 327 overlapped elements found, and we can see them on the screen here. I can't rotate them yet because of this dialog being open. And it asks you, do you want to open a deletions dialog to review the overlapped elements and delete them? I usually say no because I don't like to automatically delete things without reviewing them a little more carefully. Now, this is an overlapped element, so we don't know what it's overlapped with. It shows us, and typically it's the beams that get added here first, because you assume a beam and a quad or a tri that are overlapped. It's probably the beam that is the extra element that you want to get rid of. But that may not necessarily be the case. It could just as easily be two beams that are overlapped, and there's no guarantee that it's the same beam type in there. You may have, if you had two beams in there, you may have increased the size of one and forgot to delete the original. Now, Maestro is going to select one of those two beams to be deleted, but you want to make sure you're deleting the correct one. So I usually say no to this. Now, it did create a group of these beams that's displayed, and you can see it up at the top, groups, general, duplicated elements. So that's where it put it in the groups tree. If we did say yes to this, and we're not committed to deleting anything if you do, we'll go ahead and say yes. And all it does is it brings up the deletions dialog, which is available right there, and it loads all of these elements in there. And we can simply close this dialog, and would you like to delete all the elements? We'll just say no, and it leaves everything alone. If we go into the groups tree under general, we can see it created this duplicated elements for us. Now, a nice trick in Maestro that I like to use is to display these in the overall model, but only have these elements colored in. And the easy way to do that is you select a group and say, well, you can either do context default color or context user defined color. The default colors are, you know, the green triangles, the blue quads, and the orange beams. User defined color, we could specify a color for this group and make it red or purple or whatever. But when we display it in context, what that does is it puts that group in solids and everything else in the model as a wireframe. So it makes it a little easier, and it would be even easier if these were larger beams. They're only 5 inches, but we can see where they are in the model. We can see it's a frame that overlapped a bulkhead. So certainly we would want to get rid of that beam. Now there's 2 of them missing down here for some reason. They didn't get added in the overlapped group, and we'll find out why a little later. And you can see here's one, and there's a tank boundary there. So most of that frame should exist, but there's a section in here that overlaps with a tank boundary. And there's a set of longitudinal floors, one on center line and one 5 meters off, and one of the hull stiffeners is coincident with those elements. Now, they don't run the entire length, and I think the reason for that is when we created these beams, I told it to use the normal from the mesh, and over a good portion of the length of the hull here, where we have a flat bottom, the normal was perfectly vertical, so it coincides with those elements. But as we get further forward, we had a little bit of dead rise, so now that beam is not perfectly vertical anymore. So from this point forward, it's not considered an overlapped element because it's at an angle, almost as if, when you have a beam on a bulkhead. So it's only when the web is coincident with the element that you're going to get, it flagged as an overlapped element. We'll still want to delete it, but because of the dead rise and using the normal, it didn't get automatically flagged. And as we move a little further back, this area is also flat enough that they were vertical and coincided with the bulkhead. Now we can switch back to element type, and when you do that, it doesn't refresh the graphics and color everything in. Only the solid things got reverted to their default coloring, although in this case they were already using the default colors. So once you switch to element type, then we'll hit refresh, and that colors everything in. Now the other thing for overlapped elements is graphically you can usually see, I don't know how well this replicates on the screen share, but as you rotate around, if you do this on your own screen, you'll see the colors kind of flicker when they overlap like that. Now that we know that all of these beams were coincident with elements and the beams should be deleted, we can't simply go back into this group and delete them from here, because if we delete them from here, all we're doing is deleting them from a group. They don't get deleted from the model. So we have 2 options. One, we can rerun the integrity check and regenerate this group, and when it brings up the option, do you want to delete these, we can say yes. Or another easy way of doing it would be to take the duplicated elements here and say create a module. And when you create a module, it moves all of those elements from whatever module they were originally in, and it puts them in the module it created, which is going to be named duplicated elements, and it creates a substructure called general because that was the portion of the group's tree it was in. And that's now our current and view part. So we can see it here, and we can easily delete. Actually, we don't even need to go into the deletions dialog there. We can simply right click on that module in the parts tree and say delete it. And now all of those elements are gone, and we don't need that substructure anymore, so we can get rid of the general there. And if we rerun the overlapped elements integrity check, we shouldn't find anything in the model. And everything looks good now. But we did notice that when we checked where those items were, we did see that we had some issues here where it's not quite overlapped, but we know that beam shouldn't be there. So we have to manually go in and delete that. And the easy way of doing that is we select a piece of that beam. Now, when I clicked on it, I accidentally got the quad first. So we can click on the quad and say return item to model, and it'll put it back. And now we only have this one beam element selected. And then we simply right click, well, make sure it's highlighted, and then right click and say add by seed. And it will search in both directions until it runs out of connected elements on that beam. And it'll grab all the other bar elements on there. And you can see they're all from the hull stiffeners module, and they are all beam elements. And you can see them displayed as, or they've been added to the selection set and sort of deleted from the graphics. You just see the outline. And the easiest thing is to just delete them. If you were worried that you accidentally selected something more, you could put them in a group or move them to another module, but we know we have what we want, so we'll go ahead and delete those.